I stood in the freezing rain outside 42 Beacon Hill, watching my daughter scrub floors through the window of what used to be my home, and realized that some betrayals are so complete they can only be answered with total annihilation. My name is Arthur Sterling. I'm 77 years old. For the past 15 years, the world believed I was rotting in a foreign prison or buried in an unmarked grave somewhere in Eastern Europe. They were half right. I was in hell, but I clawed my way back for one reason: my daughter, Emily. The night I returned to Boston, the sky wept. Freezing rain battered the cobblestone streets. I stood before my red brick fortress, intentionally disguised in worn clothes and an unkempt beard. My hands shook as I rang the doorbell. I imagined Emily opening it, 33 now, maybe married, happy. I'd built this life for her before everything went dark. The woman who answered wasn't the princess I'd left behind. She was a shadow. Emily looked skeletal, drowning in a maid's uniform 2 sizes too large. Her hands were raw, cracked, bleeding in places. When our eyes met, there was no recognition, only terror. She asked if she could help me, her voice barely a whisper. Before I could reveal myself, I heard that voice, that shrill, venomous voice that had haunted my darkest moments abroad. Beatrice, my sister-in-law, descended the marble staircase I'd paid for, dripping in diamonds I'd probably funded, radiating cruelty like heat from a furnace. She called me Arthur's rat, her words soaked in mockery. Beside her stood Caleb, her son, now 36, drinking my vintage whiskey and laughing at what he thought was my complete destruction. They didn't recognize me behind the beard and rags, but they remembered my name well enough to spit on it. What happened next changed everything I thought I knew about the depth of human evil. Beatrice explained their masterpiece of deception with the casual pride of an artist discussing her life's work, never suspecting that the beggar before her was taking mental notes for a reckoning. She told me their version of history. According to the story, they'd fed Emily for 15 years. I hadn't disappeared into a nightmare of international espionage gone wrong. No, I'd abandoned my family, stolen everything, and fled like a coward. They claimed I'd left behind astronomical debts that fell on Emily's shoulders. For a decade and a half, they'd enslaved my daughter under the pretense that she was working off my fictional crimes. But the true horror was my grandson. Noah, 6 years old, suffered from a severe congenital heart condition. The boy needed expensive medication, regular monitoring, constant care. Beatrice and Caleb used him as a hostage. If Emily stopped working, if she questioned anything, if she showed even a hint of rebellion, they'd cut off Noah's medical payments. They'd let my grandson suffocate slowly while his mother watched. I listened to every word with the stillness of a man who'd learned patience in places where one wrong move meant death. Beatrice seemed to enjoy explaining how thoroughly they'd broken Emily. She described how my daughter scrubbed toilets at 3 in the morning, how she ate table scraps, how she'd become so grateful for their mercy in letting her stay in her own home that she'd kiss Beatrice's hand after particularly brutal days. Caleb added his own touches to the story, boasting about the psychological warfare. He told me they'd convinced Emily that I'd been spotted in the Bahamas, living it up with stolen millions while she suffered. They'd shown her forged documents, manufactured evidence, testimonies from paid actors claiming to have seen me. The cruelty wasn't just in the lie, but in its completeness. They'd poisoned every memory Emily had of me. Her childhood, her father's love, the sacrifices I'd made, all of it rewritten as the manipulations of a con man who'd never cared at all. When Beatrice threw $200 bills at my feet, calling it charity for a dead man's ghost, I accepted them with trembling hands. I thanked her with the broken voice of a man who'd been defeated. I shuffled toward the door like the beggar they believed I was. But I didn't leave, not really. I climbed into the black sedan where Mr. Blackwood, my attorney, weighted with equipment that would change everything. We'd planted listening devices throughout the house during my approach. What we heard over the next 3 hours made my blood run cold, but it also gave me exactly what I needed. Caleb forced Emily to clean wine he'd deliberately spilled, making her get on her hands and knees while he stood over her. He told her that Noah's medication would be delayed unless she moved faster. We heard my daughter's quiet sobs, her whispered apologies, her desperate prayers that her son would survive another day. In that moment, I decided that prison would be too merciful for them. I needed to destroy them completely, and I had the means to do it. The question wasn't if I would strike, it was how devastating I could make it when I did. The rain had stopped by the time Blackwood drove me to the offices of Sterling Security International, the company I'd built in the shadows while the world thought I was gone. And I began to understand that my disappearance had been the best thing that ever happened to my enemies until it became their worst nightmare. I need to tell you how I survived 15 years of hell. It matters because it explains what I became and what I was willing to do. In 2008, I was contracted by the State Department for a security consultation in Moldova. Routine work, or so I thought. Instead, I walked into a trap set by people who wanted my expertise and my silence. I spent 3 years in a concrete cell that measured 6 feet by 8 feet, tortured for information about American intelligence networks I didn't possess. When they finally realized I was exactly who I claimed to be, just a private security contractor, they didn't release me. They sold me to another group with different questions. I survived by becoming useful. I designed security systems for criminals while secretly documenting everything: names, operations, money trails. After 7 years, I had enough information to buy my freedom and guarantee my survival. I traded intelligence to 6 different governments in exchange for protection, money, and most importantly, the ability to operate in the shadows. By the time I escaped in 2021, I wasn't the man who'd left Boston. I'd built a network. Sterling Security International had contracts in 43 countries. My personal worth exceeded $800 million, most of it hidden in structures so complex that even I needed lawyers to explain them. But I'd done something else during those years, something Beatrice and Caleb couldn't have imagined. I'd protected Emily's inheritance through an international trust structure that made it virtually impossible to access without specific legal keys that only I possessed. The house on Beacon Hill, the investments, everything I'd built for my daughter remained locked away, generating income that should have been hers. Blackwood pulled up the financial records on his laptop as we drove. Over 15 years, the trust had generated nearly $4 million in dividend income alone. Every penny had been intercepted by Beatrice, who'd somehow obtained enough documentation to impersonate Emily as the trust's representative. It was fraud on a staggering scale, compounded by tax evasion and identity theft. We spent the night reviewing every transaction. Beatrice had purchased a vacation home in Martha's Vineyard. Caleb drove a Ferrari. They'd taken 17 international trips, stayed in 5-star hotels, bought art and jewelry, and everything their poisonous hearts desired. All while Emily scrubbed floors and begged for scraps. I made a decision that night. I wouldn't just expose them. I wouldn't simply reclaim what was mine. I would trap them in their own greed and watch them destroy themselves, trying to grab even more. Blackwood outlined the plan I'd already begun forming. We would create an irresistible opportunity, something so lucrative that Beatrice and Caleb would sacrifice every last shred of caution to seize it. We would make them think they'd won completely, that they'd finally secured their stolen fortune forever. Then we would show them what it felt like to have everything stripped away in a single moment. By dawn, we'd created Meridian Holdings, LLC, a shell company backed by real money and impressive credentials. We prepared an offer for the Beacon Hill property that would make even the greediest hearts race. $12 million, cash, closing in 24 hours. The trap was set. All I needed was for them to be exactly as greedy and stupid as I knew they were. I watched from a car across the street as the courier delivered the purchase offer to 42 Beacon Hill at precisely 9 in the morning, and even from a distance, I could feel the moment greed overpowered whatever minimal caution Beatrice possessed. Blackwood had crafted the offer beautifully. Meridian Holdings represented an overseas investor looking to acquire prime Boston real estate for immediate occupancy. The buyer, allegedly a reclusive tech billionaire, wanted no inspections, no contingencies, no delays, just $12 million wired to their account within 24 hours of signing. We'd calculated the number carefully. It was high enough to seem like a once-in-a-lifetime windfall, but not so astronomical that it would trigger serious suspicion. The property's actual value hovered around $8 million. Our offer represented a 50% premium for speed and certainty. Through the listening devices, we heard Beatrice's shriek of joy. She immediately called Caleb, who arrived within 20 minutes. Their conversation revealed everything I needed to know about their financial situation. They were drowning. The money they'd stolen had been spent faster than it came in, funding a lifestyle they couldn't actually afford. They had debts, obligations, and a growing desperation that made them vulnerable. Caleb raised the concern I'd anticipated. The house was technically held in trust with Emily as beneficiary. They'd need her signature to complete any sale. I heard the cruelty in his voice as he suggested how they'd obtain it. What followed made me grip the door handle until my knuckles turned white. They called Emily to the study. Beatrice explained that a generous buyer wanted to purchase the house, and that this money would finally settle all the debts I'd supposedly left behind. More importantly, it would secure Noah's medical care for life. They'd place $3 million in a fund specifically for the boy's treatment, they promised. Emily would never have to worry about his medication again. All she had to do was sign a document renouncing any claim to the property or its proceeds. Just a formality, they assured her, a legal requirement to clear the title. Emily hesitated. Through the audio feed, I heard her ask if she could read the full document. Beatrice told her there was no time, that the buyer would walk away if they didn't move immediately. Caleb added that Noah's next medication refill was due in 3 days, and the pharmacy had already called about the unpaid balance. My daughter asked if they were sure this was the right thing to do. I heard the exhaustion in her voice, the desperate hope that maybe, finally, her nightmare would end. She asked if this meant she and Noah could have a small apartment somewhere, maybe just 2 rooms, somewhere safe. Beatrice assured her that of course they'd take care of her. "Family takes care of family," she said, her voice dripping with false warmth. Emily signed. I heard the pen scratching across paper, heard her quiet prayer that this would save her son, heard Caleb's barely suppressed laugh. The moment the signature was complete, the mask dropped. Caleb informed Emily that she and Noah would need to be out of the house within 48 hours. They'd find somewhere for her to go, maybe a shelter, somewhere appropriate for people in her position. The money for Noah's care would be handled through them naturally. They couldn't trust Emily with that kind of responsibility, given her history. That's when Emily broke. She asked what history they meant. She'd done everything they'd asked for 15 years. Never complained, never questioned. Why were they treating her this way? Beatrice told her the truth with casual cruelty. There was no medication fund. There never would be. Emily had served her purpose. She'd signed away her rights to the property, and now she was simply in the way. They'd throw her enough money for a month's rent somewhere cheap, and after that, well, that was her problem. When Emily asked about Noah, about the promises they'd made about his care, Caleb laughed. He suggested maybe she should have thought about that before her father abandoned them and left them drowning in his mess. I heard my daughter collapse. The listening device picked up her sobs, her desperate pleas, her begging them to at least help Noah. They left her there on the floor, crying, while they went to celebrate their $12 million victory. Blackwood put his hand on my shoulder as I sat in that car, shaking with rage. He reminded me that in 24 hours we would have everything we needed. I just had to wait one more day. I'd waited 15 years. I could wait 24 more hours before I burned their world down. The conference room on the 42nd floor of One Boston Place offered panoramic views of the city I'd built my fortune in, and I chose it specifically because I wanted Beatrice and Caleb to see exactly how far they would fall when I destroyed them. The closing was scheduled for 2 in the afternoon. I'd arrived 3 hours early with Blackwood and a team of people, whose presence would only make sense once the trap snapped shut. FBI Special Agent Rodriguez sat in an adjacent conference room, reviewing the mountain of evidence we'd compiled. My personal physician, Dr. Sarah Chen, waited with a full medical team to examine Emily and Noah the moment they arrived. And my head of security, Marcus Webb, a former Delta Force operator I'd worked with in Moldova, coordinated the dozen operatives positioned throughout the building. At 1:30, Beatrice and Caleb swept into the building lobby like royalty. She wore a white Chanel suit that probably cost $15,000. Caleb had on his Ferrari jacket because, of course, he did. They brought Emily with them, dressed in her maid's uniform. They had insisted she attend to sign additional documents, they'd told her. What they really wanted was to parade their control one final time. I watched them enter the conference room on the video feed from my private office down the hall. Emily looked worse than she had 3 days ago. Dark circles under her eyes, hands trembling, the weight of 15 years of abuse visible in every movement. She held Noah close to her chest. The boy looked pale, his breathing slightly labored, even from the camera feed. Beatrice and Caleb ignored them entirely. They examined the view, admired the expensive furnishings, and discussed what they'd do with $12 million. Vacation homes in Tuscany, apparently, maybe a yacht. Their attorney arrived, a nervous man who clearly handled basic real estate transactions and was in over his head. He began arranging documents while making small talk about the unusual nature of such a quick closing. At exactly 2 o'clock, I changed clothes. Gone were the beggar's rags. I wore a navy Tom Ford suit I'd had tailored in London specifically for this moment, Italian leather shoes. A watch worth more than Caleb's Ferrari. I shaved carefully, revealing the face I'd seen gradually age in mirrors across a dozen countries while I fought to survive and build something worthy of reclaiming. When I looked in the mirror, I saw my father. He'd been a hard man who'd built a security empire from nothing and taught me that men protect what they love with everything they have. He'd died when I was 30, never knowing I'd disappear into darkness for 15 years. But I think he'd have approved of what I was about to do. Blackwood went to the conference room first. He introduced himself as the seller's representative and began making apologies. The principal investor was delayed, he explained, but would arrive shortly. Perhaps they could begin reviewing the documents while they waited. I gave them 15 minutes to get comfortable, to start imagining the money landing in their accounts. I wanted them feeling victorious and untouchable. Then I straightened my tie, picked up the leather portfolio containing their destruction, and walked down the hallway towards the conference room where my enemies waited. Marcus spoke in my earpiece. FBI was in position in the adjacent room. Building security had sealed the exits. Medical team was standing by. Everyone was ready. I opened the conference room door and stepped inside. For a moment, nobody moved. Beatrice was signing something, her hand frozen mid-signature. Caleb stood by the window, his champagne glass halfway to his mouth. Their attorney looked confused, glancing between me and his clients. Emily sat in the corner with Noah, and when our eyes met, I saw recognition flicker and then confusion. She knew she'd seen my face somewhere, but couldn't reconcile the beggar from the storm with the man who'd just entered, dressed like he owned the building, which actually I did. That was detail I'd kept even from Blackwood. I'd purchased One Boston Place 2 years ago through a holding company. The entire 42nd floor was mine. I set my portfolio on the conference table, looked directly at Beatrice, and spoke the words I'd rehearsed for 15 years. "Hello, Beatrice. I'm the buyer, though actually I don't need to buy what already belongs to me." The color drained from her face so fast I thought she might faint. Caleb dropped his champagne glass. It shattered on the marble floor, the sound sharp and final in the sudden silence. Emily stood slowly. Noah clutched against her chest, her eyes growing wide as she finally understood who I was. And that's when I began to explain exactly how deep their grave was, and how I'd been digging it for 15 years. I asked Emily to cover Noah's ears because what I was about to explain would involve numbers that represented her stolen childhood, and I didn't want my grandson's introduction to his grandfather to be through a lesson in how evil humans could be to those they claimed to love. Beatrice tried to speak, to explain, to manipulate. I raised one hand and she stopped. The gesture held authority earned in the dark places where words meant survival or death. She recognized something in my eyes that made her sink back into her chair. I began with the foundation. The property at 42 Beacon Hill wasn't just a house. It was the primary asset in the Sterling Family Trust, an irrevocable structure I'd created in 2007, 1 year before my disappearance. The trust held the property, 7 other real estate investments, and a diversified portfolio of dividend-generating stocks and bonds. Emily was named as the sole beneficiary with access beginning on her 30th birthday. The trust had been designed to be bulletproof. Multiple trustees in different countries, each with specific limited powers. No single person could access the principal or divert the income without proper authorization from me or my designated successors. I'd learned from my security work that the best protection wasn't one massive lock, but a dozen smaller ones that required different keys. But Beatrice had found a crack. After my disappearance, she'd filed legal documents claiming I'd died abroad. She'd presented forged paperwork suggesting she had power of attorney over Emily, who was 18 at the time. She'd convinced one of the original trustees, a man who's since died, that she was acting in Emily's best interest during a traumatic time. Once she had partial access, she'd systematically looted the income stream. For 15 years, the trust had generated approximately $43,000 monthly in dividend income. Beatrice had intercepted nearly every dollar, routing it through a maze of accounts that eventually led back to her personal spending. I pulled out the first document from my portfolio, bank statements showing the trust's income deposits to an account Beatrice controlled. She'd set up an entity called Sterling Family Support Services, making it look like a legitimate management company. Through that shell, she'd stolen $4.7 million. Caleb's face had gone from arrogant to green. Their attorney had quietly moved his chair away from them, recognizing he was sitting next to walking felonies. But that was just the beginning. I pulled out the second set of documents, tax records. Beatrice had never reported the stolen income. $4.7 million in undeclared earnings meant she'd evaded approximately $1.8 million in federal and state taxes. That wasn't just fraud. That was a federal crime that came with mandatory prison time. The third set of documents detailed the identity theft. To access the trust income, Beatrice had repeatedly impersonated Emily. She'd signed documents using Emily's name, created fake identification, and essentially assumed her identity for financial purposes. I'd counted 37 separate instances of identity theft over 15 years. Emily was crying now, but these weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of understanding. For 15 years, she'd believed she was paying her father's debts, shouldering his mistakes, sacrificing herself for his sins. Now she understood that there were no debts. There never had been. She'd been a slave in her own home, serving the people who'd stolen her entire life. I turned to Beatrice. She looked small now, diminished, the diamonds around her neck suddenly looking like chains. I told her that every luxury purchase she'd made, every vacation and car and piece of jewelry had been bought with money stolen from a child she'd claimed to love. My voice was calm, professional, almost gentle, but there was no mercy in it. Caleb tried to run. He actually bolted for the door. Marcus, who had been standing quietly by the window, moved with the speed that comes from decades of special operations training. Caleb was on the floor in handcuffs before he'd taken 3 steps. That's when I opened the conference room's connecting door, and Special Agent Rodriguez entered with 3 other FBI agents. I'd been working with Rodriguez for 8 months, since the moment I'd learned what Beatrice and Caleb had done. We'd built the case meticulously, ensuring every document was authenticated, every transaction traced, every law violated properly documented. Rodriguez told me later that it was the cleanest, most thoroughly documented financial crime case she'd ever prosecuted. As the agents read Beatrice her rights, she finally broke. She screamed that I'd abandoned them, that I'd left Emily with nothing, that she'd done what she had to do to survive. The lies poured out in a desperate torrent. I let her finish. Then I pulled out the final document in my portfolio. It was a letter written in 2008, just before my disappearance. In it, I had outlined the trust structure and explained to Emily that no matter what happened to me, she would be protected. I'd asked Beatrice, as my sister-in-law and Emily's aunt, to ensure Emily understood her rights and received proper guidance when she came of age. I'd trusted Beatrice to protect my daughter. That letter, which I'd kept a copy of in a Swiss bank vault, would ensure her prison sentence was as long as legally possible. Beatrice and Caleb were let out in handcuffs. The conference room fell silent except for Noah's quiet breathing and Emily's muffled sobs. I looked at my daughter, this woman I'd last seen as a teenager, now broken and exhausted and free. I asked her if she knew who I was. She nodded slowly. Then she stood, still holding Noah, and walked toward me with steps that seemed uncertain, like she was afraid I might disappear if she moved too quickly. When she finally reached me, when she looked up at my face and saw her father looking back, she whispered one word through her tears, "Dad?" I pulled them both into my arms and held them, while 15 years of anguish poured out of her. I promised her that everything would be all right now, that I would fix everything, that she and Noah were safe. But there was still one more thing I needed to do before this nightmare could truly end. Dr. Chen entered the conference room with her team while Emily and I were still holding each other, and I watched my daughter's face transform from relief to terror when she realized I wanted doctors to examine Noah immediately. She explained frantically that Beatrice controlled Noah's medical care, that there was no money for additional doctors, that they'd cut off his medication if she didn't do what they wanted. Her words tumbled over each other in a cascade of fear that made my heart break. I took her hands and explained that Beatrice no longer controlled anything. I told her about the money I'd built over 15 years, about the resources available to us now, about the fact that the best pediatric cardiologist in Boston was standing 5 feet away, waiting to examine her son. Emily looked at Dr. Chen like she was a mirage. She asked how much the examination would cost, whether they took payment plans, whether she'd need to sign something promising to pay later. These were the questions of someone who'd spent 15 years terrified that any expense would be the one that killed her child. Dr. Chen knelt down so she was eye level with Emily and told her gently that there would be no bill, no payment plan, no debt. She'd been retained by me to provide whatever care Noah needed with no limits and no conditions. Emily collapsed into a chair, the weight of 15 years of terror finally releasing its grip. She held Noah close and whispered to him that everything was going to be okay now, that the nice doctors were going to help him. The examination took 40 minutes. Dr. Chen's team worked with the efficiency of professionals who were used to critical cases. They performed an EKG, drew blood, checked his oxygen saturation, and reviewed the medical records I'd already obtained through a combination of legal requests and methods that were better left unexamined. When Dr. Chen returned, her expression was carefully neutral, which told me immediately that the news wasn't good. She asked if Emily wanted to speak privately, but Emily shook her head. She'd had enough secrets and hidden information to last a lifetime. Noah had severe congenital heart disease, Dr. Chen explained. He'd been born with a malformed valve and several structural defects. The condition was manageable with proper medication and monitoring, but he'd eventually need surgery to repair the damage. That surgery was complex and expensive, but it was also routine at the right facility with the right surgeon. Then Dr. Chen said something that made Emily's face go white. Based on the blood work and Noah's current condition, he'd been receiving inadequate medication for months, possibly longer. The prescriptions Beatrice claimed to be filling had apparently been partially filled or diluted. Noah was surviving on roughly 60% of the medication he needed. If it had continued much longer, Dr. Chen said carefully, Noah would have suffered heart failure. He was perhaps 6 months away from a medical crisis that would have been fatal. Beatrice hadn't just stolen money and freedom, she'd been slowly killing my grandson to maintain control over Emily. Emily asked Dr. Chen what happened now. The doctor smiled and said that now Noah would get proper care. She'd already arranged for a complete cardiac workup at Boston Children's Hospital first thing in the morning. Once they had a complete picture, they'd schedule the corrective surgery with Dr. James Morrison, the top pediatric cardiac surgeon in the country. The surgery and all related care would cost approximately $700,000. I told Emily not to worry about the cost. What I didn't tell her yet was that the trust she'd just unknowingly signed away to Beatrice was still hers, that the signature had been obtained under duress and fraud, and that within a month she'd have access to millions of dollars that had always been her inheritance. There would be time for financial discussions later. Right now, I wanted her focused on Noah's recovery. Dr. Chen's team left to make arrangements. Emily and I sat in that conference room as the sun set over Boston, painting the city in shades of orange and gold. She asked me to tell her what happened, where I'd been, why I never came home. She deserved answers, and I gave them to her. I told her about Moldova, about the cell and the torture, and the years of fighting to survive. I explained how I'd built a new life in the shadows, how I'd made the money that would now secure her future. I described the moment I learned she was alive and what Beatrice had done, and how I'd spent 8 months planning this day. She asked why I'd come to the house disguised as a beggar. I told her the truth. I needed to see her with my own eyes, to understand what she'd endured, to witness the full scope of Beatrice's evil. I needed to know whether she'd been broken or whether the daughter I'd loved was still fighting underneath the abuse. When she'd looked at me with kindness that night, when she'd handed that beggar a piece of bread with gentle concern despite her own suffering, I'd known that Emily's spirit had survived. That gave me hope that we could rebuild what had been stolen. Emily was quiet for a long time. Then she asked the question I'd been dreading. She wanted to know if I blamed her for signing away her rights to the house, for being weak, for not fighting harder. I told her that weakness was the last word anyone would ever use to describe her. She'd survived 15 years of psychological torture while keeping a sick child alive and protecting his innocence. She'd endured horrors that would have destroyed most people, and she'd done it with grace and dignity. The fact that she was sitting here now, still capable of love and hope, was proof of a strength I could barely comprehend. The house didn't matter, I told her. The money didn't matter. What mattered was that she and Noah were safe now, and that we had time ahead of us to build something new. She asked if I'd stay this time, if I was really back, or if this was temporary. I promised her that I was home for good, that nothing would separate us again, that whatever years I had left would be spent making up for the 15 I'd lost. As night fell over Boston, Emily finally allowed herself to believe that the nightmare was over. We left the conference room together, a grandfather meeting his grandson for the first time, a daughter reunited with her father, a family beginning the long process of healing. But there was still one final act to complete. Beatrice and Caleb's arrest was just the beginning. I needed to ensure they paid for every moment of suffering they'd caused. And I had one more card to play that would guarantee they'd spend decades contemplating their evil from behind bars. The prosecution of Beatrice Sterling and Caleb Hayes became the most talked-about white-collar crime case in Massachusetts history, and I made certain that every moment of their downfall was documented. Publicized and preserved for the day, Noah would be old enough to understand that justice, while slow, is sometimes perfectly thorough. The federal charges came first. Special Agent Rodriguez presented the case to a grand jury that needed exactly 4 hours to return indictments on 37 counts of wire fraud, identity theft, tax evasion, and conspiracy. The evidence I'd gathered over 15 years made the prosecution's job almost absurdly easy. But I wanted more than federal charges. I wanted Beatrice and Caleb to face the community they'd fooled for 15 years. So I worked with the Massachusetts Attorney General's office to bring state charges as well: elder exploitation, false imprisonment, extortion, and assault. Each charge carried significant prison time. The preliminary hearing happened 3 weeks after their arrest. I sat in the gallery with Emily and Noah, who was recovering beautifully under Dr. Chen's care. Beatrice and Caleb entered in prison jumpsuits, their transformation from arrogant aristocrats to common criminals complete. Their defense attorney tried to argue that Beatrice had genuinely believed I was dead and had acted in Emily's best interest. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s named Margaret Thornton, asked one simple question that destroyed the defense. If Beatrice had Emily's best interests at heart, why was Emily sleeping on a cot in the basement and eating scraps while Beatrice wore Chanel and vacationed in Europe? The attorney had no answer. Judge Thornton denied bail, citing risk of flight and the severity of the charges. The trial itself began 4 months later. The prosecution called Emily as their first witness. I watched my daughter take the stand and describe, in calm and measured words, what her life had been for 15 years. She explained the sleeping arrangements, the food rationing, the psychological manipulation. She described how Beatrice used Noah's illness as a weapon, threatening to withhold medication whenever Emily showed any hint of independence. The defense tried to break her during cross-examination, suggesting she'd exaggerated her suffering or misremembered events. Emily looked the defense attorney in the eye and held up her hands, which still bore scars from years of cleaning chemicals and rough work. She asked if these looked exaggerated. The prosecution then called a parade of witnesses I'd assembled. The pharmacy that had filled Noah's prescriptions testified that Beatrice had repeatedly asked for partial fills while paying full price, pocketing the difference. Neighbors testified to seeing Emily treated like a servant. The trustees from the Sterling Family Trust explained how Beatrice had systematically deceived them. But the most damning testimony came from Caleb's former girlfriend, a woman named Sarah, who'd ended their relationship 3 years earlier. She described overhearing Caleb and Beatrice laughing about how easy it was to manipulate Emily, how they called it playing house with a free servant. She'd recorded one conversation on her phone, shocked by their cruelty, and had kept it ever since. In that recording, played for the entire courtroom, Caleb and Beatrice discussed what they'd do if Emily ever discovered the truth. Beatrice suggested they could always institutionalize her, claim she'd had a breakdown, make her disappear. Caleb agreed, adding that nobody would miss a Maid. The jury heard Emily's sobs from where she sat beside me. They saw a mother who'd been terrorized for 15 years while caring for a sick child and believing she was paying her father's debts. They saw the evidence of nearly $5 million in theft. They saw the medical records showing Noah had been systematically denied proper care. The jury deliberated for 90 minutes. They returned guilty verdicts on every single count. At sentencing, Judge Thornton addressed Beatrice and Caleb directly. She said that in 30 years on the bench, She'd rarely encountered such calculated, sustained cruelty toward a vulnerable person. She noted that they'd targeted a young woman who'd lost her father, exploited her child's illness, and stolen her entire young adulthood. Beatrice received 23 years in federal prison, followed by 12 years on state charges, to be served consecutively. With good behavior, she'd be 91 years old before she'd be eligible for parole. Caleb received 18 years federal and 10 years state. He'd be 74 at his earliest possible release. The judge also ordered them to pay restitution of $7.2 million, covering the stolen funds, interest, and compensation for Emily's unpaid labor over 15 years. Since neither Beatrice nor Caleb had any legitimate assets left, the money would come from selling everything they'd purchased with stolen funds. After sentencing, I stood with Emily and Noah outside the courthouse as reporters shouted questions. I gave them a statement I'd prepared carefully. I explained that my daughter had survived 15 years of abuse with courage that humbled me. I said that she'd protected her son while enduring horrors that would have broken anyone else. I announced that Emily would be taking her rightful place as director of the Sterling Family Trust, and that she'd be using her experience to establish a foundation dedicated to protecting elderly people and their families from financial exploitation. Then I asked the reporters to give my family privacy to heal. We'd said everything that needed saying. The rest was between us and the new life we'd build together. As we walked away from the courthouse, Emily squeezed my hand. She whispered that she wished this could have happened without destroying Beatrice and Caleb so completely. Despite everything, she still had the kindness to feel something like pity for them. I told her that pity was a luxury they'd never afforded her, and that sometimes justice required complete destruction of those who showed no mercy. They'd made their choices knowing exactly what they were doing. Now they'd live with the consequences until their last breath. Noah tugged on my hand and asked if we could go see the ducks in the public garden. He'd been reading about them and wanted to know if they were real. I lifted him onto my shoulders and told him, absolutely, we'd go see every duck in Boston. We had time now. We had all the time in the world. I'm writing this from a terrace overlooking Lake Zurich, watching Noah chase butterflies through gardens that once belonged to a banker who tried to have me killed in Moldova, and I find myself understanding that revenge, while satisfying, pales in comparison to the simple joy of watching a 7-year-old boy laugh without fear. The legal aftermath took 6 months to fully resolve. Emily's signature on the property renunciation was invalidated due to fraud and duress. The Sterling Family Trust was restructured with proper oversight, and Emily as its sole beneficiary. The real estate investments had appreciated significantly, and combined with the recovered stolen funds and continued income, Emily now controlled assets worth approximately $14 million. More importantly, Noah received his surgery 3 months after Beatrice's conviction. Dr. Morrison performed the procedure at Boston Children's Hospital, and it was textbook perfect. Noah spent 2 weeks recovering, his small body healing with the resilience of youth. Today he runs and plays like any other 7-year-old. He'll need checkups throughout his life, but his prognosis is excellent. Emily used her experience to create the Sterling Protection Foundation, dedicated to identifying and preventing elder exploitation. The foundation provides legal services, financial advocacy, and support to families dealing with the kind of manipulation Beatrice perfected. In its first year, they've helped 43 families recover stolen assets and prosecute abusers. She also bought a house in Cambridge, a beautiful Victorian, with a yard where Noah can play. She's dating a teacher she met at Noah's school, a good man named James, who treats her with the gentleness she deserves. I've had dinner with them several times, watching Emily laugh freely for the first time in 15 years, and it heals something in me that I didn't know was broken. As for me, I divided my time between Boston and Switzerland. Sterling Security International continues to operate, though I've handed day-to-day operations to people I trust. I'm 78 now. I've earned the right to slow down. I bought the penthouse in Zurich partly for the view, and partly because Noah asked if we could visit the place where Swiss chocolate comes from. He's obsessed with chocolate lately. I've told him we'll take a tour of every chocolate factory in Switzerland this summer. Emily laughed and said, I'm spoiling him. I told her that's precisely what grandfathers are for. The house on Beacon Hill sold for $11 million. Emily didn't want to keep it, didn't want to live surrounded by memories of her suffering. I understood. Some places carry too much pain to ever feel like home again. We donated the proceeds to a shelter for abused women and children. I've thought often about Beatrice and Caleb in prison. Occasionally, news reaches me about their lives. Beatrice works in the prison laundry. Caleb reportedly got into a fight during his first month and spent time in solitary. They're learning what Emily already knew, that powerlessness and isolation are their own kind of torture. Part of me wonders if I should feel guilty about the completeness of their destruction. I destroyed them financially, legally, socially, and personally. They'll die in prison, forgotten and despised, their names synonymous with cruelty and greed. But then I remember Emily's hands, scarred and raw from cleaning chemicals. I remember Noah's labored breathing before his surgery. I remember 15 years of a young woman's life stolen by people who claimed to love her, and I feel no guilt at all. Sometimes people ask how I survived 15 years of hell. The answer is simple. I survived because I had something worth surviving for, because somewhere in Boston, my daughter needed me even if she didn't know I was coming, because giving up would have meant abandoning her to monsters. The hardest part wasn't the physical torture or the years of isolation. It was knowing that while I suffered, she suffered too, and I couldn't protect her. That knowledge ate at me every single day. When I finally held her again, when I finally made things right, it justified every moment of pain I'd endured. Noah calls me Grandpa Art. He doesn't know the full story of what happened before I entered his life. Emily and I agreed he should learn the truth gradually, when he's old enough to understand moral complexity. For now he knows that his mother is strong, that his Grandpa Art loves him, and that he's safe. This morning, before Noah woke up, Emily and I sat on this terrace drinking coffee and watching the sun rise over the Alps. She asked me if I was happy, not content or satisfied, but genuinely happy. I told her the truth. I'd spent 15 years in hell, lost my wife to cancer before I disappeared, watched my daughter suffer through things no person should endure, and nearly lost my grandson to medical neglect. But sitting there, knowing she and Noah were safe and thriving, knowing justice had been served and evil punished, I felt something very close to peace. She asked if I had any regrets. I thought about it carefully. I regretted not being there for her 18th birthday, her 20s, the birth of her son. I regretted every moment Beatrice and Caleb stole from us. But I didn't regret how I'd handled their destruction. They'd earned every consequence they faced. Emily told me that she used to pray every night for 15 years that I'd come home. Even after she believed I'd abandoned her, some part of her kept hoping I'd walk through the door and fix everything. And I did, just 15 years late. I reminded her that some people spend their entire lives waiting for rescue that never comes. We were lucky in our way. We found each other again. We had time to rebuild. She asked me one final question. What did I want to do with whatever years I had left? I looked at Noah sleeping peacefully in the sunlight, his small chest rising and falling in the easy rhythm of a child who'd never known fear or pain or want. I thought about all the years I'd missed, all the experiences I'd lost to darkness and survival. My answer was simple. I wanted to be present. I wanted to teach Noah how to fish, how to throw a baseball, how to be a man who protects those weaker than himself. I wanted to watch Emily build her foundation and help families avoid the nightmare she'd survived. I wanted to take trips to places we'd never been and create memories that had nothing to do with pain or revenge or justice. I wanted to live fully and completely in the time we had left together. Emily smiled and said, "That sounded perfect." Then Noah woke up, ran onto the terrace, and demanded to know if today was the day we'd promised to visit the chocolate factory. So that's where I'm going now, to a chocolate factory with my grandson, followed by lunch in a village that looks like a postcard, and then maybe we'll take a boat ride on the lake. Tomorrow doesn't matter. The past is settled. The present is everything. I learned something in 15 years of hell. Life isn't measured in the years you live, but in the moments you're truly alive. I'm alive now, watching Noah's excitement, hearing Emily's laughter, feeling the warm sun on my face. Beatrice and Caleb took 15 years from me, but they couldn't take what mattered most. They couldn't take my daughter's spirit or my grandson's future. They couldn't take the love that brought us back together or the justice that made us free. If you're watching this from somewhere comfortable, with people you love nearby, take a moment to appreciate it. Call someone you care about. Fix that relationship you've been neglecting. Protect the vulnerable people in your life. Don't wait for tomorrow to show up and do the right thing. And if you're someone who preys on the weak, who exploits the vulnerable, who steals from those who trust you, remember this story. Remember that sometimes the dead come back. Sometimes the powerless become powerful. Sometimes justice takes 15 years, but it comes anyway. I'm Arthur Sterling. I'm 78 years old. I've lived through hell and come out the other side with everything that truly matters. And I wouldn't change a single moment of the fight it took to get here. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a date with a chocolate factory and a 7-year-old who believes that Swiss chocolate might be actual magic. He might be right. Thank you for watching this story. If you're tuning in from anywhere in the world, drop a comment below letting me know where you're watching from. And if this story moved you, consider subscribing. There are more stories of justice, redemption, and the strength that comes from never giving up, even when everything seems lost.